In this short podcast, we'll be discussing the Bracero Program and the documentation, the contract agreements. All went into it that played a part in the borderlands. So the Bracero Program was a series of bilateral agreements. I say series because it lasted from 1940s to middle of the 1960s. It was between the United States and Mexico, allowing for millions of Mexican guest workers to temporarily work in the United States, primarily in agriculture. And this agreement that happened between the two countries was initiated during World War II as a response to the labor shortages in the U.S. Results from the war draft, U.S. was in need of labor work, typically free. So that's when they resulted to Mexico to get Mexican guest workers because they knew Mexican immigrants were trying to get into the U.S. from the creation of the Border Patrol. But the U.S. and Mexican governments signed a series of agreements to permit Mexican laborers into the U.S. on a temporary basis. These said guest workers were there on a contract, were there for work, and when that was it, they were provided housing, conditions, protections. It was supposed to be mutually benefit arrangement, but often led to issues with working conditions. Wages, they didn't always get their wages, and then when they did, they were shorter, were given less than what they were told, and treatment. There was a lot of abuse, harsh treatment from workers, just U.S. citizens in general. Some workers faced substandard housing and exploitation by employers, as mentioned. They were recruited to work on U.S. farms, typically in El Paso, Texas. It addressed to demand agricultural labor, temporary employment for Mexican workers. That's where the mutual agreement came into play, but it wasn't necessarily mutual, as U.S. didn't follow its guidelines of fair treatment and protections, which then from this program led into the creation of Operation Wetback because of the millions Mexican immigrants that migrated into the U.S. from this program. Not all of them, a majority of them were undocumented. It opened the gateway for Operation Wetback, which escalated into something worse than the Bracero Program. It played a significant impact on the U.S. and Mexican economies. On one hand, it helped address labor shortages in the U.S. during the war, but then it was, on the other hand, criticized for the exploitation and mistreatment of the Mexican guest workers. Also had lasting effects on migration patterns, contributed to a massive growth of Mexican communities in the U.S. due to this program. At the end of their contracts, the Braceros contracts, they were expected to return to Mexico. So depending on how long that contract agreement they had was their time in the U.S., at the end of that, they were to return. Again, not all of them returned. Operation Wetback took place. Choosing to stay illegally caused later issues of undocumented migration, like we had mentioned. The end of the program was 1964, getting a lot of growth, criticism of its labor practices, concerns about Mexican workers and their treatment. But the program still continues to influence discussions on migration policies, migration in general, guest work programs. During this time, it was also the outlay of this was so similar to an indentured servant, which is basically what it is, but for indigenous peoples. But yes, it ended, related to temporary guest work programs and challenges. Balancing labor needs with worker protections just wasn't what the U.S. country kind of did a little backhand on them, said, we will give you this, but never did. So yes, the program ended in 1964. It's the Bracero Program is often cited in discussions about contemporary immigration policies, most related to temporary guest work, indentured servant. They kind of go hand in hand.